The more you learn about our universe and how it operates, the better the science you will be able to do. You see, in order to do science, one must think about the universe rationally. But just what exactly is rationality? The Cambridge English Dictionary defines rationality as the quality of being based on clear thought and reason. A simplification of the observation of famous German scholar Max Weber characterizes rationality by dividing it into 4 types that he observed. They are the purposeful, emotional, traditional, and ethical. Let's look at purposeful rationality within research first. Purposeful rationality holds that outcome is king. But if you have an outcome in mind, you cannot be impartial about the research you are conducting, as you are trying to deliberately achieve a specific end. Northwest Nuclear Laboratories holds that the best science is done when we make data-driven decisions, not dogma-driven decisions. But just exactly what is dogma? The dictionary defines dogma as a principle or set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true. Dogma-driven research is not research at all, but merely the appearance of research for the purpose of producing propaganda. Approaching research with this type of rationality subjects the outcome to extreme bias and renders questionable the veracity of the conclusions from the start. Research conducted with the outcome already in mind will only lead to predetermined conclusions. Emotionally based rationality, on the other hand, is subject to inconsistencies which vary with the feelings of those conducting the research. Such research is not likely to come to the same conclusion, given the same evidence, any 3 times in a row, and therefore is not considered reliable. Third in the list is traditional rationality. This is usually a function of habit and culture and operates replete with the modicum, "Well, that's the way we always did it before." Literally trapped in its heritage, this mindset resists the new at any cost and rarely offers up true discovery of any kind. Finally, there is ethical rationality. This rationality is driven from the conscience and believes in the existence of objective truth, which can only be known by examining the facts diligently and then applying logic rigorously to achieve what is often a surprising outcome. That the outcome is surprising is testimony to the lack of bias involved and endorses both the discoverer and the discovery. Now let's click down on this ethical rationality and understand that it is formed at the very earliest moments of human cognition, when this capacity for pattern recognition encounters regularity in the 5 primary sensory data streams of touch, taste, hearing, seeing, and smelling. Subsequently, we discover our fingers and our toes, and our binky and our baba. From there, and over time, we instinctively begin dividing the information we are learning into 2 distinct buckets. One contains things we know, and the other contains things we believe. We refer to the second bucket of things we believe as truth. Things we only know have not risen to the level of confidence yet whereby we can move them to the bucket of truth, either because the information is incomplete or the assumptions whereby we synthesize the knowledge are too broad to be reliable. Within the bucket of the things we call truth is the knowledge we begin to trust and act upon. At this point, we begin to develop a healthy skepticism when we act upon things we thought we could trust and discover we were incorrect about what we believed. Over time, we hone this capacity to determine what is true from what is false, and we come to value truth as an essential ingredient to our success. Every day we are alive, we are constantly encountering new information which needs to be sorted into these 2 buckets. Life quickly teaches us that there are those who offer us knowledge that is not true for selfish ends, and we must apply additional caution and not blindly accept whatever is put before us. We learn to verify, cross-check, validate, and research the claims of others so that we do not advertise false information and thereby undercut our own credibility. We come to understand that our ability to be trusted as someone who tells the truth consistently is critical to our advancement, and so learn to guard our integrity and reputation. When we are found to have mismanaged truth, we suffer the brutal persecution of our own conscience, and so learn the price of owning our own self-respect. This development continues in largely subjective experiences without formal training in most cases. However, over time, we become aware through the operation of our conscience of the 800-pound gorilla in the corner of our lives named morality. It seems we've been endued with another intrinsic capacity, like our rationality, which is constantly passing judgment on the equity and fairness of what we say and do. It operates upon whatever we have put in our bucket of truth and holds us accountable to our beliefs. We also find that at times its operation is terribly inconvenient and prevents us from doing things for sheer pleasure. Soon we discover we can dismiss the warnings of our conscience by lying to it through a process we simply call rationalization. We reason with ourselves and thereby argue our way into believing that what we are doing is right, or at least justified, even when it's wrong. Welcome to humanity, a species that has an instinctive moral code written deep within, which it does not obey. Finally, due to the limitations imposed by our conscience for holding as truth things which are not socially convenient, we begin adopting a more liberal set of beliefs so that we can conform more readily to the society in which we find ourselves. Without fully realizing it, we are treading the path to self-deception, hypocrisy, denial, and bias based entirely on convenience. This, in large part, explains the makeup of current Western culture. It is at this juncture I shall propose a very challenging question. Just what kind of truth should I be placing in my truth bucket? Things that are popular? Things that feel true? Things that are convenient? Or things that are true? If you chose things that are true, then you fall into a minority right off the bat, as a cursory review of any newspaper will tell you. Reason, in large part, is merely a tool of convenience to be wielded in defense of whatever bias or politic you have, and the art of doing so is a well-established industry called journalism. Propaganda is its primary deliverable, and due to the number of venues available in the information age, propaganda is available in a veritable litany of colors and flavors. Alas, I digress. Let's drill down deeper into the idea of setting the boundary on our bucket of truth at the level of what is true. How is that to be done? A very famous man once asked, "What is truth?" He walked away before hearing the answer, but we shall not. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. Now, if at this point you lack any sensation of being fully enlightened, it is because this fact requires additional context to be useful. We must now go on to define reality. And that is no small enterprise, for as you may recall, there is a standing majority of adherents to the idea that truth is born of convenience and is largely subjective and relative to begin with. But what if it could be shown that there was truth that was not? Truth that was absolute, transcendent, changeless, infinite, eternal. Truth that could only be understood in one way and by one definition. No matter how many times you asked the question, the answer was always the same. Truth that existed before the universe was, and truth that will exist after it has theoretically dissipated in heat death at the end of all time. If it could be shown that such truth exists, then we would say there is absolute truth, which cannot be tarnished or changed by convenience, no matter who tries to do the changing, and no matter how many alternative facts he may present. If you are intrigued with the idea of knowing absolute truth, then I have good news for you. Such truth exists. It is called mathematics. I shall demonstrate. There is a ratio within mathematics called pi. It is the ratio between the diameter of a circle and its circumference. The calculation of that ratio is a somewhat tedious piece of work, but the advent of the computer has allowed us to confirm our suspicion that the sequence of numbers it produces is infinite and yet never repeats. If I run the calculation to a quintillion digits, and the quintillion in first digit is a 3, then the next quintillion times I run that sequence, the quintillion in first digit will continue to be a 3. This symmetry and regularity is mind-bogglingly precise, and we have conceived a methodology of inquiry constructed from this underlying universal symmetry to discover truth about reality. We call this methodology science. Science is merely a rigorously precise way we have to ask questions. We call these questions hypotheses. Within the practice of science are many believers in the existence of objective truth which corresponds to reality, or they wouldn't be practicing science. Those who labor endless hours trying to discover relative truth pursue abject futility. Science is all about the discovery of objective truth. And because the goal of science is to achieve the highest degree of confidence it can regarding the integrity of the truth it discovers, it utilizes mathematics to establish the veracity of its experiments so that it may be proven that what is found is truth. Therefore, mathematics is an absolute calibration standard for both truth and logic. Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner said, "The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve." We should be grateful for it and hope that it will remain valid in future research and that it will extend, for better or worse, to our pleasure and even though perhaps also to our bafflement, to wide branches of learning. Through mathematics, the practice of science has delivered enormous amounts of truth into our hands in the area of physics, chemistry, biology, botany, medicine, astronomy, and the list goes on and on. Science has achieved an exponential output of knowledge in the last decade, and the rate is ever increasing. Science is extremely clear about the rules for finding truth, and if it is discovered that opinion, convenience, tradition, emotion, or any other form of bias has influenced the objective pursuit of the research, the research is debunked, and the researchers suffer a substantial loss of credibility. At a minimum, science insists that all it pursues be empirical, testable, falsifiable, and naturalistic. Therefore, when science draws a conclusion or someone speaks in the name of science, whatever they say enjoys a special credibility that other forms of knowledge do not enjoy. Science can be brutal in its denunciation of those who attempt to bend the conclusions to fit their pet theories. Consider Albert Einstein, who created a cosmological constant to support a steady-state theory he held dear regarding the origin of the universe. And it was later shown mathematically that the universe was expanding and had a beginning, something Albert found terribly inconvenient and in the end, highly embarrassing. Science has a habit of disregarding that which is popular and supplies that which is novel in its place. And so it is regarding the question of origins. Origin questions are a part of the big questions we ask in life. Questions like, where did we come from? What is the meaning of life? And what happens to us when we die? The specific origins questions we ask of science regard the beginning of the universe and the beginning of cellular life. Of late, scientists have had real difficulty in answering those two questions in particular. Popular consensus has argued we evolved from life spawned in some warm little pond long ago. In 1859, when Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species, the science of his day seemed to be in his favor. But the clock has been ticking, and the discoveries of the last 50 years have been breathtaking. Today's science clearly doesn't support the theory any longer. Join me now in learning why so many evolutionists are pushing back on the recent discoveries in science.
The crucial question that will decide the debate about biological origins is precisely the question of the origin of information. If you don't have instructions, if you don't have information, you can't build anything in life.
Everyone who works in biology knows that information is needed in order for a living cell to do what it does. On the other hand, there's this huge mystery surrounding information, because we also know as humans that information doesn't come from nowhere, it has to come from somewhere. So you have this big question mark in the origins question in biology: where did all the information come from?
Until 530 million years ago, the oceans of the early Earth were almost completely void of animal life. Then, within a geologically brief span of perhaps 10 million years, the waters were suddenly alive, teeming with a riot of complex animals, representing most of the major animal body plans that have ever existed on our planet. Known today as the Cambrian explosion, this mysterious episode in life's history was familiar to Charles Darwin, who regarded it as a disturbing challenge to his theory of gradual and unguided evolution by natural selection. During the past century, the mystery of the Cambrian explosion has deepened as scientists have discovered the central role played by biological information in the history of life.
The Cambrian explosion is not just an explosion or the abrupt appearance of many new forms of animal life. It's also an explosion, or would have required a huge infusion or generation of new biological information. Biological form requires biological information.
Scientists' understanding of biological information advanced dramatically when Cambridge University researchers James Watson and Francis Crick made a startling discovery. They found that the structure of the DNA molecule stores information in the form of a 4-character digital code. Strings of precisely sequenced chemicals called nucleotide bases supply the assembly instructions, the information, for building the crucial protein molecules that living cells need to survive. Crick later came to realize that the chemical constituents in DNA function like letters in a written language, or digital symbols in a section of computer code. Just as English letters convey a particular message depending on their arrangement, the sequences of chemical bases along the spine of the DNA molecule convey precise instructions for building proteins. The arrangement of these bases directs the arrangement of the 20 different kinds of amino acids that make up protein molecules. proteins in turn perform a vast array of critical jobs inside cells, catalyzing reactions, processing genetic information, and forming the structural parts of molecular machines and other biological structures. Building new animals requires many new protein molecules, and building new proteins requires new biological information.
I used to ask my students a question when I was teaching. If you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would know. They would say code or software or instructions, a program. All those are the correct answer. To generate a new function in a computer, you have to have code. You have to have instructions. The same thing turns out to be true in biology. This is the great discovery of the second half of 20th century biology, that information is running the show in biological systems. To build a new form of animal life requires cell types, requires proteins, and therefore requires genetic information. And that's the big question that the Cambrian explosion presents. If you want to think about how to build an animal, how would these animals get built, you have to have some explanation for the informational requirements of their construction.
According to modern evolutionary theory, new proteins and new forms of animal life arise through random genetic mutations sifted by natural selection. But in an alphabetic text or a section of computer code, random changes typically degrade meaning or functionality and ultimately generate gibberish.
As we've come to appreciate the digital or typographic character of genetic information, it raises some really interesting questions about the efficacy of that mutation-driven mechanism. We know from computer code, for example, that if you start making random changes to a section of computer code, you're much more likely to degrade the information that's there already than you are to come up with a new operating system or program.
This problem has long been recognized by computer scientists, mathematicians, and engineers, including a group from MIT who convened a now famous conference at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia in 1966. These scientists met to consider whether the random mutation natural selection mechanism could conceivably generate enough biological information to build a new animal or even a new protein in the time available to the evolutionary process. One of these scientists was MIT engineering professor Murray Eden.
No currently existing formal language can tolerate random changes in the symbol sequences which express its sentences. Meaning is almost invariably destroyed. Murray Eden, MIT.
Eden knew that random changes to alphabetic or digital characters inevitably degrade the information in any section of alphabetic text or digital code, and for a very good reason.
Whether you're talking about digital code in a software program or a section of text in an English sentence or book, or the genetic text in DNA, there are vastly more ways to arrange the relevant characters that convey the information in a way that will produce gibberish than there are that will produce function or meaning.
Eden and his colleagues suspected that the genetic code faced a similar difficulty. When it came to producing new genetic information, at least enough to generate a new protein, the random mutation natural selection mechanism had to deal with what mathematicians call a combinatorial problem. In mathematics, the term combinatorial refers to the number of possible ways that a set of objects can be arranged or combined. In genetics, the combinatorial problem poses a severe challenge to the random mutation natural selection mechanism. To understand why, imagine a thief who would like to steal a beautiful new bike. All that stands between the thief and the bike is a lock with 4 dials, each marked with the numbers 0 to 9. But there is only one correct combination that will set the bike free.
The reason a bike lock works is that there are vastly more ways of arranging those numeric characters that will keep the lock closed than there are that will open the lock.
A thief without knowledge of the combination must guess the right combination from among 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 possibilities. That's 10,000 possible combinations, which usually would be more than enough to defeat a random search for the one right combination. Yet there is still a way the thief might succeed. if he has enough time to try enough combinations, he might eventually identify the right one by chance. For example, if trying each combination takes 10 seconds, then in 15 hours an especially diligent thief could try more than 5,000 combinations, or more than half of the total possible combinations. In that case, he would be more likely to succeed than to fail in opening the lock. But now imagine a much more complicated lock. Instead of 4 dials, this lock has 10 dials. Instead of 10,000 possible combinations, this lock has 10 to the 10th power, or 10 billion possible combinations. With only one combination that will open the lock out of 10 billion, it's much more likely that the thief will fail, even if he devotes his entire life to the task. So what about relying on random mutations to search for a new DNA sequence capable of directing the construction of a new functional protein? Would such a random search for new genetic information be more likely to succeed or fail in the time available to the evolutionary process? In other words, is a random mutational search for a new gene or protein more like the search for the combination on the 4-dial lock or the 10-dial lock? The scientists at the Wistar conference were unable to definitively answer that question because at the time, no one could adequately quantify how hard the search problem was.
So in the late 1960s, one could make these arguments based upon analogy to things we understood, written language, computer code, but we didn't have any experimental data to show whether those analogies actually suited the biological case. So no one could come up with the exact numbers to answer these questions back then.
Molecular biologists at the time did know that the number of possible combinations corresponding to any given sequence of DNA is extremely large and grows exponentially with the length of the molecule in question. For example, corresponding to one short protein 150 amino acids long, there are 10 to the 195th power other amino acid arrangements of that length. That's an unimaginably large number. But scientists in the 1960s didn't know how many of those arrangements were actually functional. They didn't know, in effect, how many combinations would open the lock. That didn't stop evolutionary biologists from speculating. Many argued that there must be a high proportion of functional sequences among all possible sequences, so that a random search for a new functional sequence would have a high probability of success.
The way they did that is to say, well, maybe biological sequences are not nearly as finicky, not nearly as picky about which characters are where as written language is or as computer code is. And so that's the track that they took. That maybe proteins don't really care which amino acid is where, and there's a great deal of variability, and therefore you can have the same function performed by a huge number of protein chains and a huge number of genes.
But recent experiments in molecular biology and protein science have replaced speculation with data. These experiments have established that DNA-based sequences capable of making functional proteins are in fact extremely rare among the vast number of possible sequences. Just how rare? After working at Cambridge University, molecular biologist Douglas Axe set out to answer that question, using a technique called site-directed mutagenesis. His experiments enabled him to estimate that for every DNA sequence that generates a functional protein of just 150 amino acids in length, there are 10 to the 77th amino acid arrangements that will not fold into a stable three-dimensional protein structure capable of performing that biological function. One correct sequence for every 10 to the 77th power incorrect sequences. That's equivalent to searching for just one combination on a lock with 10 digits on each of 77 dials. To put this in perspective, keep in mind that there are only 10 to the 65th atoms in the entire Milky Way galaxy. Could random genetic mutations effectively search a space of possibilities that large in order to find even a single functional protein sequence?
So given that you have this very daunting probability, 1 in 10 to the 77th power, How could something that improbable happen? Well, as we know generally with improbable things, the way that they can happen is by having lots and lots of opportunities for them to happen. So for life, those opportunities take the form of individual living organisms in which a mutation could occur that could conceivably provide the solution. No matter how rare it is, if you get enough of these opportunities, it can become probable. So the question is, if the number is 1 in 10 to the 77th power, if that's the improbability that must be overcome, would the number of organisms that have existed on the planet since the beginning of life come close to matching that number? And it turns out that it doesn't come anywhere close.
During the entire 3.5 billion year history of life on Earth, it is estimated that only 10 to the 40th individual organisms have ever lived. Yet 10 to the 40th power represents only a small fraction of 10 to the 77th power, only 1 10 trillion trillionth to be exact. In other words, for even a single functioning protein fold to arise, the mutation selection mechanism would have time to search just a tiny fraction of the total number of relevant sequences, 1 10 trillion trillionth of the total possibilities. It follows that it is overwhelmingly likely that a random mutational search would have failed to produce even one new functional protein fold in the entire history of life on Earth. Of course, the building of new animals would actually require the creation of many new proteins. For this and other reasons, a number of scientists are now questioning the creative power of the random mutation natural selection mechanism. Even evolutionary biologists writing in professional peer-reviewed biology journals are acknowledging difficulties with traditional evolutionary theory. Some are willing to admit we already live in a post-Darwinian era, while others are calling for new theories of evolution. Meyer and Axe are part of a growing minority that has urged the consideration of another possibility. For Meyer, the recognition of that other possibility grew out of his work as a PhD student in the philosophy of science at Cambridge University. During his studies, Meyer ended up examining the scientific method used by Charles Darwin in his classic work On the Origin of Species. Darwin's method focused on trying to establish the causes of events in the remote past, in history. Darwin's historical scientific method is different from what many people ordinarily think of science.
It's a much more forensic style of reasoning than your ordinary experimental bench science. You're reasoning from the clues that are left behind, from the evidence that we have before us, back to the probable or possible causes that might explain what produced life in the first place, or what produced animal life, or what produced those clues that lie before us. And I ended up doing my dissertation in Cambridge on the historical scientific method. And one of the things I discovered in the process of my research was that there was this distinctive method. It has a name, and that name is the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the method of inferring to the best explanation.
But how do scientists studying biological history determine which explanation is actually best? Meyer found an answer again in the work of Darwin and his contemporary, the great geologist Charles Lyell, who argued that in explaining the past, the present is the key. Lyell insisted that we should seek explanations based on our knowledge of presently acting causes, or causes now in operation. All this led Meyer to ask a critical question.
What is the cause now in operation for the production of digital information? Because the crucial question in the origin of animal life and the origin of life itself is, where did the information come from? Information stored digitally in the DNA molecule. Where did that information come from that is necessary to build these new forms of life? And I realized that the answer to that question is intelligence. The cause now in operation, the cause of which we know from our uniform and repeated experience, another key idea from Lyell, that is capable of producing information, is intelligence. Whether we're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription, or a paragraph in a book, or a section of computer code, or even information embedded in a radio signal, whenever we see information especially when we find information in a digital or typographic form, and we trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So the discovery that information is running the show in life, the discovery that there are these huge infusions of information in the history of life, such as the one that occurs in the Cambrian explosion, suggests that a designing intelligence has played a role in the history of life. And it also suggested to me that it was possible to formulate a scientific case for intelligent design, that is, a case for intelligent design based on the same scientific method of reasoning that Charles Darwin had used in The Origin of Species. And so if you want to say intelligent design isn't science, you would have to say that the Darwinian argument in The Origin of Species is also not science, but no one really wants to say that. He's not using an unscientific method, he's just using a different method of scientific reasoning, an historical method of scientific reasoning, and I use that exact same method in formulating the positive case for intelligent design in both Darwin's Doubt and in Signature in the Cell.
The science of today flatly states through solid mathematical probability theory that the idea that the causality behind the origin of life involves some random naturalistic process is utterly preposterous. When we accept that verdict and apply a causality which is non-random and therefore intelligent, then we have the key we need to unlock the rest of the mystery of life. Are there scientists willing to do that? Yes, in abundance, and their numbers are growing rapidly.
As a scientist,
microbiologist,
biochemist,
as a geologist,
neuroscientist,
physician,
Biologist and an engineer.
I think there is overwhelming evidence for intelligent design in nature.
I see intelligent design in the history of life,
in the genetic code of life,
in the molecular machines inside our cells,
in the complexity of life,
in the information embedded in living things,
in the operation of the human brain,
in the features of the human body,
in the chicken and egg causal circularity of life.
As a mathematician, I see great evidence of purpose in the universe.
As a molecular biologist, I see evidence for design everywhere I look, pretty much.
Nature is incomprehensible without inference to purpose and to intelligent design.
The properties of the universe as a whole, and our planet in particular, were fine-tuned for our benefit and for our survival.
In my view, the fossil evidence clearly points towards intelligent design.
I see life as designed because when I look at life at the molecular level, I see exquisite engineering.
all cells contain DNA, which include lots of information, and information is only the product of a mind.
Darwin thought living cells were just blobs of jelly, but when I look in a living cell, I see evidence of factories, machines, three-dimensional architectures, enormous amounts of encoded information.
There's power generators, there's manufacturing plants.
Life contains many features that we know from experience only arise from the activity of intelligent agents.
The genetic code is like a software program. It's like somebody would have had to be a coder, would have had to form this particular genetic code. When I see that order and design, I have a really hard time believing that random mutation and natural selection alone can cause the complexity and the diversity we see in life.
When you look at nature at large, what you see is incredible examples of innovation which surpass human technology. Examples include the flight capabilities of a hummingbird, sonar in bats, and greater innovation always implies greater intelligence from a designer.
If you read the message from the molecules, it's really clear. They say clearly, intelligent design, intelligent design, intelligent design is the source of life.
Today, there is a groundswell within the scientific research of qualified scientists who are changing position with regard to the question of origin, because the data continues to lead us in only one direction. One such discovery concerns the origin of the universe itself.
How does something come out of nothing? How do we have a universe that comes out of nothing? Astronomers believe there are 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. Scientists are still trying to figure out how all of this arose, seemingly out of nothing.
Well, it turns out if you apply quantum mechanics to gravity, then in fact space itself becomes dynamical, and universes, spaces themselves and time can pop into existence where there was none before.
So you can create whole universes where there was no universe before. And indeed, in that way, you might imagine creating a universe from literally nothing. Whole universes from literally nothing out of existence. Whole universes nothing, nothing.
Wait, our universe popped into existence from literally nothing? There is no cause for all of this? So, straight up nothing. No matter, no creator, then poof, the universe? That's actually the story some atheist scientists are peddling right now. Sounds pretty desperate to me. Stephen Meyer, a philosopher of science and best-selling author, explains how atheists got backed into this corner.
It was generally assumed by most physicists prior to the 1920s and 30s that the universe was eternal and therefore self-existent, that it had always been here and really didn't require an explanation. There was one physicist said an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of the universe at any finite time in the past.
But then, the idea of an eternal universe was challenged by a pair of surprising discoveries. First, it became clear that almost all the galaxies in the universe are moving away from us. Then it got weirder. 2 guys figured out that generally the farther a galaxy is from us, the faster it's moving away. One was a Belgian physicist and Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. The second was American astronomer Edwin Hubble. Drawing on Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity, they then realized that space itself is expanding. Physicist Brian Miller explains why.
Let me use an analogy. If you have a balloon and you imagine putting dots on that balloon to represent galaxies, and then that balloon inflates, what happens is all the dots move away from each other. And dots that are further apart will move away from each other even faster. And that's exactly the sort of evidence we see in our universe.
This discovery suggests that if you reverse time, like a movie running backward, then all the galaxies would draw back together to a single point, which led to a conclusion that some scientists didn't really want to face.
The universe has been expanding from a finite beginning point, where not only matter and energy, but time and space itself began.
Today, scientists call this first moment of the universe the Big Bang.
It all started with the Big Bang.
The Big Bang theory means the universe is not eternal after all. It has a beginning. Even more radical, the Big Bang implies that the cause of the universe must be something non-material.
The Big Bang shows that all of time, matter, space, and energy started at a single moment in the past. Therefore, whatever started it has to be outside of time and space.
You can't posit a materialistic explanation because there's no matter there before the beginning to do the causing.
Many scientists initially resisted the Big Bang, including Einstein, whose theory partly inspired the idea.
He really didn't want at that point in his career to think about the beginning of the universe because he didn't want to think about what would be necessary to explain the origin of the universe if we're talking about all of matter, all of energy, all of space and time.
Einstein eventually accepted the Big Bang theory, but others went on searching for an option that would fit the data without requiring an actual beginning. One that grabbed a lot of attention was the oscillating universe model.
The universe would be expanding outward, but then as the expansion slowed, the matter in the universe by gravitational force would cause the universe to recollapse. But once it recollapsed, then by some unknown mechanism, it would expand again. So you'd get a series of big crunches followed by big bounces. That theory ran into 2 big problems. The first was it was discovered that there was not enough matter in the universe to cause the universe to recollapse. And secondly, it was determined by thermodynamic analysis. The energy available to do work would diminish with each successive cycle. It would be kind of like a ball bouncing to the ground, and finally it would damp out where there's no more bounces.
Who's going to get it? They drop it. Oh, man.
So the oscillating universe model was a big fail. And actually, all the attempts to evade a true cosmic beginning ran into serious problems. The evidence for the Big Bang kept piling on until most scientists accepted it. Some scientists, however, found themselves facing serious doubts, not about science, but about atheism. World-renowned astronomer Robert Jastrow didn't believe in God, but he found it hard to get around what the Big Bang seemed to be telling him.
So there is a beginning, there is a point in time from which it all started. And that's a remarkable thing because it has a very strong theological flavor to it. And that intrigued me because I am an agnostic, and if there was a beginning, a moment of creation in the universe, then there was a creator.
Of course, a lot of scientists still resist going where the science seems to be leading. Take physicist Stephen Hawking. Before his death, he proposed a new argument against the need for a cosmic creator.
Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing.
Now, when I first read that, I was staggered because it's self-contradictory to start with. Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can create itself from nothing. That's a flat contradiction. And then to say the universe can create itself, that's logical nonsense. If I say that X creates Y, roughly speaking, I'm saying if you've got X, you may in the end get Y. But if I say X creates X, then that simply proves to me that nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered scientists say it.
Well, what about physicist Lawrence Krauss and his something from nothing idea?
Imagine creating a universe from literally nothing.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Because how they get a universe from nothing is by redefining nothing.
Krauss's nothing is actually something, a set of laws and mathematical equations. That's the first problem. Meyer explains the second problem.
Krauss's nothing involves the equations of quantum physics. And equations are mathematical entities. And mathematical entities are abstract concepts, always exist in minds. So his nothing seems to imply the need for a pre-existing mind.
A pre-existing mind. Now, what does that sound like?
The Big Bang provides very, very strong evidence pointing to God. Because it shows that everything started, all matter, time, space, and energy, at some point in the past, that means that something had to start it. And that something had to be immaterial, timeless, infinitely powerful, and even personal, because only a personal being can choose to act with purpose.
But some people will embrace almost any absurdity to avoid the possibility of God.
You say there are 3 different types of nothing.
That's right.
What are the 3? I didn't know there was such a variety. A sampler platter. You haven't been rubbing any of that baby shampoo on your head, have you? With the THC in it?
Well,
no?
I'm no
You're
comment.
clean?
No comment.
You're clean?
Yeah.
Leave me a hair sample.
3 kinds of nothing or 3 kinds of nonsense. If people can convince you that our entire existence comes from nothing, then it's just a short step to believe as a product of nothing, you are nothing. That all the things you see, touch, taste, smell, think, and feel mean nothing because they came from nothing, were caused by nothing, and serve nothing. But if you and the universe were created by someone, a grand creative genius, the maker of matter, energy, space, and time, then you were made for a reason. Your existence means something. You are here for a purpose. For those willing to open their eyes, that's the amazing reality science is revealing. We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority, and we will be quiet no longer.
Embracing the theory of intelligent design enables us to fully comprehend the most profound secret of all. That at bottom, every one of us is made up of a multitude of digital computers we call cells, operating both asynchronously and synchronously on software more highly complex than any found in the Windows operating systems of today. To assume that such an operating system network could have been written by random DNA variations is laughably incredible to me, as I've worked in the computer industry for over 50 years and I understand well what happens when you randomly change computer code. In medicine, they call that cancer. I therefore draw the reasonable conclusion that the universe is preceded by an eternal, transcendent, intelligent creator whose evidential mastery of mathematics, matter, and energy on both a macrocosmic and microcosmic scale is unfathomable. This game-changing conclusion alters the meaning of our everyday lives and injects new hope for mankind into an otherwise lifeless world that scientific materialism has been painting for the last half century. But our search for truth is not over. Now that we know there is an ultimate mind behind the universe, how should we think about this theism, and exactly what is the purpose for which we have been brought into existence? The answer lies in that 800-pound gorilla we mentioned earlier named morality. He oversees our conscience and is the king of personal accountability in our lives. He honors us for doing that which is good, and he shames us for doing that which is evil. This moral compass within every man teaches us about virtue and vice, and is the source of law, order, and government within every society. But here is where we can learn a truly amazing thing. Everything mankind does that is evil, bad, hateful, despised, hurtful, and measured as a crime will be found to be an act of selfishness. Everything mankind does that is good, noble, worthy, honorable, heroic, generous, kind will be found to be an act of selflessness. And so we see that good and evil pivot upon the acts involving the self. If we do wrong ignorantly, it will be understood as a mistake and unintentional. It is therefore selfish intent that mankind abhors. This distillation of truth concerning the morality is key in showing us the true identity of God by revealing him as the author of selfless virtue within his creation. God, by that definition, therefore, would have to be the maximal expression of selfless virtue. And indeed, this expression is what we call holiness. For God to be holy, he would have to be the sum of all virtues and the greatest moral example we can find. Let's consider the picture that paints. God, by that definition, must be maximally humble, loving, merciful, kind, patient, caring, courageous, intelligent, gracious, and so on. Consider that the greatest recognition for virtue our country bestows upon a mortal is the Congressional Medal of Honor. This award is given to those willing to lay down their lives for another. It is considered the supreme measure of valor and the highest standard of virtue attainable. But wait, isn't there only one theism in which God is portrayed as having laid down his life for another? A God who transcended from beyond eternity to be born in a stable, live the life of a humble craftsman, and then be brutally murdered for confronting religious hypocrisy and corrupt leadership, all for the sake of earning humanity a pardon from his own immutable holiness. A God who cares deeply for the widow and the orphan, heals the sick, and turns the other cheek. Don't we already know such a God? And so it is, without even mentioning the Bible, quoting any scriptures, citing any miracles, we can simply and easily back into the person of God himself by looking into our own hearts and seeing that the greatest virtues ever recorded in the histories of the world are already found in the man from Galilee who rightfully claimed to be God. It is he who has come to tell us the purpose of his creation and the destiny of all mankind. When we apply this knowledge to science, we discover that the entire universe was engineered by a uniform intellect for a purpose. It is this uniformity we see reflected in its perfect mathematical adherence to principle. Believing this allows us to anticipate and discover credible engineering in nature. Indeed, We are already drawing on this great storehouse of ingenuity through the practice of biomimetics, which is the science of studying God's handiwork within nature for the purpose of creating new technologies and improving our quality of life. I hope you will give careful consideration to the ideas you have heard today and realize with me that there is important work to be done relative to the ethics and regulation needed to protect the human gene pool and indeed the gene pool of all living things. We are now in a position to both help or harm life on Earth in far more consequential ways than any science fiction movie has yet depicted, and it will take careful regulation to prevent a disaster of hideous proportions if irresponsible hands continue to take hold of genetic engineering technologies. Please also consider viewing other intelligent design videos in our library, as this is a rapidly growing area of research and the discoveries are new every day. Thank you for listening.